Hi everyone, it's so great to be with you. Today we are going to start learning Rhythm Rainbow Level 1. Okay, so to play these rhythms, we need to have something to play with. And there are a few things you can use. You could use rhythm sticks, which are wooden sticks that you can buy at a music store. Or maybe you have a couple of big wooden sticks around the house. Here are two pencils. They're wooden and they work. You might have two drumsticks around the house. Those could work for rhythm sticks. These two pens, something like this, two pens could work for rhythm sticks. Two spoons could work for rhythm sticks, or two forks or whatever. I like to use, and I'm going to use these today. These are two kitchen roll tubes, and they're really great because they're very lightweight, and they also don't make too much sound. So if there are other people in the house, you're not going to be making that much noise and disturbing everybody, and you can do your work and it will be kind of quiet. So that's a really nice thing to use. They're also free. You know, if you just take the kitchen roll, the tube from the kitchen roll. You could use toilet paper tubes as well. I like the kitchen roll. I have big hands. If you don't have big hands, the toilet paper roll might be just fine for you. So level 1 has only 2 rhythms that you need to learn. And the first rhythm is a quarter note. It also has a nickname, and the nickname is a ta. And this note is 1 beat. The value of this note is just 1 beat. So we're going to learn that it's a quarter note, that the nickname is a ta, and that it's 1 beat. Now the other rhythm that we're going to learn are 8th notes. These are 2 notes. Now you'll see the difference between the quarter note and the 8th notes. The 8th notes are called TT, and you notice there's a line here connecting these 2 notes. Now these 2 notes together equal 1 beat. They each equal a half a beat, but together they equal 1 beat. So here's ta and here's TT. So we're just going to drill that so that you really learn the quarter notes and the 8th notes. So the first thing, what is this nickname, the nickname of this note? Yes, it's a ta. Ta, 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 ta. Fantastic. Now the full name of that note is, what is it again? Do you remember? Yes, it's a quarter note. Quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. Fantastic. Now how many beats does this have? Yes, 1 beat. 1 beat, 1 beat, 1 beat, 1 beat. Okay, so those are our quarter notes. Let's just remember, how many beats does this have? 1 beat, 1 beat, 1 beat, 1 beat. Fantastic. What is the full name of this note? Quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. Fantastic. And what is the nickname? Ta, 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 ta. Great. So now let's make sure we remember or learn our 8th notes. So the full name of this is 8th notes, 8th notes, 8th notes, eighth notes. Okay, the nickname, when we say these notes, when we're learning to play them, we're going to use the nickname, and the nickname is TT, 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 TT. Does that make sense? And now each of these together, a TT together equals 1 beat. So each of them is a half a beat. Half a beat plus a half a beat. The whole thing equals 1 beat. Together, each one is a half a beat. Half a beat plus a half a beat equals 1 beat together. Okay? So that's how it goes. So, remember the nickname? Ta. That's right. Remember the nickname for this? TT. Exactly. So that's what you need to know. Okay? So now we can go and start to learn the first practice page of level 1. Okay, so I am going to give you some rhythms, and I'd like you to say them back. And I'm just going to use the tas and the TTs. I am going to play and say a rhythm, and then I'd like you to say it back. I'm going to say it quietly with you when it's your turn to say it back, okay? But play and say it back. So I play and say, then you play and say. When I do it first, I'll do it loudly, and then I'll do it softly, and that's when I want you to come in, okay? So here we go. 1, 2, my turn first. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ti. Ti, 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 ta, ta. How's that going? Does that work for you? Let's try it again, and I will play and say the rhythm, and then I will wait for you to play and say without doing it with you. Let's see how you do. My turn first. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. How did you do? Did you do that well? Good for you. Let's try it one more time, and I will play and say the first time and play and say quietly with you. So now you get used to doing it, okay? Well, I'll do it both times, loudly first and softly second with you. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. How did you do? Good job. Let's do it one last time with me playing and saying, and then you doing it alone, and let's see how it goes. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Great. And now we are going to do level 1, practice page 1. And you'll notice, go to this page and you will notice that there is a line A. And we're going to start with line A. And what we're going to do is we have a measure, the first measure, and I'm going to play and say it, and then I'd like you to repeat me. I will do it loudly and then softly, and then I will go to the second measure and loudly, and then softly do it with me. Third measure, loudly, and then softly. So here we go. A, line A. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. How did that go? Are you reading the lines, the notes? Read the notes, okay? It's really important to read the music. You're listening, but you also need to be reading and playing. So start again. Let's try A one more time. I play and say the first measure, then you do it with me, and we keep going. Ready? First measure. My turn first. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Fantastic. Do you think we can do the whole line together? The whole thing, just one measure after another. Let's try it. 1, 2, together, go. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Fantastic. How did it go? Let's try it one more time. Together. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Fantastic. Let's go to B. So I will do each measure loudly and then do it softly with you. Okay, so you do it after me. Hear it first. 1, 2, my turn first. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Let's do it again. This time, I'm not going to play it with you the second time. I want you to do it right away alone without me. I will help to show you when it's time to come in, but I think you know that anyway. Okay, B. 1, 2, my turn first. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Let's try the whole line. One measure after another. B. 1, 2, together, go. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Let's go to C. My turn first, and then you're going to do it all on your own. I will just let you, I won't repeat it with you, okay? So eat one measure at a time. My turn first. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. ti ti ta, ti ti ta. Good for you. How did it go? I think we can try doing the whole line together. Let's try it together. C. 1, 2, together, go. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Let's do C again. Are you really reading those rhythms? Read the notes, read the rhythms. C. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Let's go to D. So I do it first, then you do it. Each measure. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ti. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. How did you do? I'm sure you're doing great. Now, let's do the whole D together, okay? 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Fantastic. Let's do it one more time. D. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Good. Let's do D one more time. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ta, 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 ta. Fantastic. You guys are so smart. I just love this. Shall we try doing A, B, C, and D all the way through together? I think we can do it. If it falls apart, don't worry. We'll do it again. You just do it again. That's how we learn music. You just do it again. You just have to keep at it. It's really important just to keep at it. So keep reading the music. I will tell you when the next line is. So if you're not with us at any point, you can come in with us when we start a new line. Okay? So let's start with A. 1, 2, A, go. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta. B. Ta, ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. C. Ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. D. Ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ta. How did you do? Good for you. This is so good. Let's do the whole thing one more time, okay? A, B, C, and D. So if you somehow lose your place in A, you can come in on B. I will let you know when it's time. As you heard me calling it out, I call out each line. So let's try it again. A, B, C, then D. 1, 2, A, go. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, beat, ta, ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, si, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 di, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ta. Good for you. You can keep practicing this. Just go back and practice it again if you feel you need to do it again. If this feels good and you want to go on to the next page, the next practice page, then go right ahead. Because it's this, these are this, you will have the same rhythms on practice page 2. So that will be the next video to go to. Congratulations. Keep at it. Stick at it. This is so good for your brain. Okay, bye. Hi, everyone. My name's DIANA JACKLIN. I'm an opera singer, song recitalist, and voice teacher, but I'm also here to offer you some basic music education for your children or for yourselves. So if you like this channel, if you like these videos, if you want me to do more for you, please subscribe and please like and please share with your friends.